A hunter in Pennsylvania this fall will load a rifle chambered in a cartridge that made a company famous, that still bears the name of that company on the head stamp, and that was designed entirely by a man who died without ever getting rich from it. The 253,000 Savage was the first commercial cartridge in American history to push a bullet to 3,000 feet per second. A genuine milestone that generated headlines, drove rifle sales, and cemented Savage Arms as a serious innovator in the American firearms market for the next century. Before that cartridge, the same designer had already given Savage the 22 High Power, a round so effective that a missionary in China used it to bring down man-eating tigers, generating exactly the kind of sensational publicity a young cartridge needed to become a legend. 2 cartridges. 2 genuine commercial triumphs. One designer behind both of them. His name was Charles Newton, and he was not an employee of Savage Arms. He was an independent inventor, a lawyer by trade who treated cartridge design as an obsession rather than a career. And he handed Savage 2 of the most successful cartridges the company would ever sell. Newton spent the rest of his life trying to build his own rifle company around his own name, and watched it fail, and fail again, sued into bankruptcy by his own creditors, forced into receivership more than once, dying in 1932 without ever achieving the wealth that 2 genuinely revolutionary cartridges should have bought him many times over. Savage Arms built a business on his genius. Tonight we are going to find out exactly what he got in return. Charles Newton was not a trained engineer and he was not a company man, and understanding both of those facts is essential to understanding what happened to him. He was a practicing lawyer in New York State, and cartridge design was, by every account, a genuine passion rather than his profession, the kind of obsession a serious mind pursues in every spare hour it can find. That is worth sitting with, because it means every cartridge Newton produced came from a man competing, in his off hours, against firearms companies that employed full-time professional engineers with dedicated testing facilities and institutional resources behind them. He beat them anyway, repeatedly, working the problem the way only a genuinely gifted amateur obsessive can, unconstrained by institutional convention and free to pursue ideas a company engineer might never have been permitted to chase. The guiding philosophy he held, documented across his own writing and the accounts of those who worked with him, was straightforward and, in retrospect, ahead of its time. He believed in building the largest case a given caliber could reasonably support, so that a heavier powder charge could drive a bullet to genuinely high velocity, delivering flatter trajectory and more effective terminal performance than the smaller, more conservative cases most manufacturers were building around at the time. That philosophy produced, in 1912, the 22 Savage High Power, a round Newton built by necking down the existing 25-35 Winchester case to accept a small, fast-moving bullet, an unusual and genuinely innovative concept for its era. Savage adopted it, manufactured it, and marketed it aggressively, and the round earned a level of sensational publicity that a small cartridge rarely achieves. Reverend H.R. Caldwell, a missionary working in China, used the 22 High Power to bring down man-eating tigers weighing 400 pounds, and Savage built real advertising campaigns around that exact story, a small, fast bullet felling one of the most dangerous animals on Earth. That is the kind of publicity no marketing department can manufacture on its own. It requires an actual cartridge capable of actually doing the thing being advertised, and Newton had built exactly that. 3 years later, in 1915, Newton returned to Savage with an even more significant design. A cartridge built specifically to fit the popular Model 989 lever-action rifle the company sold, necked down from the .30-06 case to accept a smaller bullet at genuinely exceptional velocity. This became the 253,000 Savage, And it would go on to become one of the most commercially important cartridges the company ever produced. A round still manufactured and still respected by serious hunters more than a century after Newton first designed it. That is the man this story belongs to. Not a company engineer drawing a salary while a corporation owned everything he produced, but an independent inventor who handed two genuinely transformative cartridges to a company he did not work for. Cartridges that generated real profit, real publicity, and real long-term brand value for Savage Arms across more than a century of continuous production. He was owed, at minimum, a fair and sustainable share of the value those two cartridges generated for the company that built its reputation on them. What he actually received and what he did with what little leverage his own reputation as a designer gave him afterward is where this story turns considerably darker. Consider what a fair arrangement would have looked like from the vantage point of an independent designer in the 1910s. An era with no established norms for royalty structures on cartridge designs the way patent law had already established for mechanical inventions. A rifle mechanism could be patented and licensed with clear, enforceable terms. A cartridge, by contrast, occupied murkier legal territory. Easier for a manufacturer to simply adopt, name, and market without the same enforceable ongoing obligation to the man who had actually done the engineering. Newton was operating in exactly that gap, contributing genuine, provable engineering value to a company with no binding structural requirement to share the ongoing proceeds of that value with him in any sustained way. The betrayal in this story unfolds in two separate acts, and both deserve to be told plainly, because they reveal two different ways an industry can fail to properly reward the man who actually built its most valuable products. The first act happened during the design of the 253,000 itself, and it is a small, specific disagreement that tells you almost everything you need to know about the imbalance of power between an independent inventor and the company he was dealing with. The original vision Newton held for the cartridge called for a 100-grain bullet, a genuinely well-reasoned choice for a round intended as a serious deer hunting cartridge, delivering the kind of terminal performance a hunter actually needed in the field. Arthur Savage, the founder of the company that would manufacture and sell the round, had a different priority entirely. He wanted a lighter 87-grain bullet, not because it was the better hunting choice, but because a lighter bullet, driven by the same case and the same powder charge, could be advertised at exactly 3,000 feet per second, a genuinely eye-catching marketing figure that a 100-grain bullet loaded to a more modest and more practical velocity could never quite claim. Newton argued against it. He believed, and said so publicly even after the cartridge was released, that the heavier bullet was the better hunting round and that Savage had prioritized an advertising slogan over the actual field performance of the cartridge he had designed. He lost that argument. Savage held the manufacturing capability, the distribution network, and ultimately the final say over what left the factory carrying the name of the company, and an independent designer with no ownership stake in the company had no real leverage to insist otherwise. The 87-grain loading shipped, the 3,000 feet per second marketing claim became the defining identity of the cartridge, immortalized permanently in its very name. The 250-3000, and Newton watched a company build its advertising campaign around a compromise he had specifically warned against, using his own design as the vehicle for a marketing decision he had no power to prevent. That is the first act, small in isolation but revealing in what it demonstrates. Newton had the engineering judgment. Savage had the actual control. And when those two things conflicted, engineering judgment lost. The second act is larger and considerably more consequential, and it concerns what happened after Newton, having watched two of his designs make Savage Arms a considerable amount of money, decided to build something entirely his own. Beginning around 1914, Newton set out to establish his own rifle manufacturing company, the Newton Arms Company. Built around his own name, and his own increasingly ambitious cartridge designs. An attempt to finally capture, as an owner rather than an outside contributor, the kind of value that Savage had captured from his earlier work. It should have been the natural next step for a designer of his demonstrated ability. It failed. Newton Arms Company lasted little more than a year before the venture collapsed, and Newton himself, in a detail that captures the particular bitterness of his situation, ended up suing his own company into bankruptcy. He tried again under a different structure, the CHAS, Newton Rifle Corporation, and that venture too collapsed, entering receivership in 1918. Further attempts followed under further company names: the Buffalo Newton Rifle Company, the Leverbolt Rifle Company, and each one, despite being built around a man whose cartridge designs were demonstrably among the finest of his generation, failed to achieve the lasting commercial stability that Savage Arms had built substantially on the strength of his earlier work. Newton had the engineering genius to design cartridges that made other companies famous. He never managed to build the business infrastructure, the capital access, or the manufacturing scale required to capture that same value for himself. And every attempt he made to do so ended the same way: in receivership, in bankruptcy, in a company bearing his own name failing, while the cartridges bearing the Savage name kept selling. That is the actual shape of this betrayal. Not a single dramatic theft, but a structural imbalance repeated across an entire career, in which the man who could design the product was never the man positioned to capture its value. And every attempt he made to close that gap on his own terms ended in financial ruin. Here is exactly what Newton built, and here is precisely why both cartridges succeeded as thoroughly as they did. The .22 Savage High Power, introduced in 1912, was built by necking down the existing .25-35 Winchester case, itself a necked-down version of the .30-30 Winchester, to accept a small .22 caliber bullet weighing 70 grains. That combination, a genuinely large case for a bullet that light, was the exact expression of the core design philosophy Newton held: maximum reasonable powder capacity behind a given bullet diameter, and it produced a round that left the muzzle at roughly 2,800 feet per second. A genuinely startling velocity for a .22 caliber hunting round in 1912. When most cartridges in that bore diameter were built for small game and pest control rather than anything resembling big game hunting. That velocity, combined with a bullet construction capable of expanding dramatically on impact, produced exactly the kind of dramatic terminal performance that made the tiger hunting stories plausible rather than merely promotional exaggeration. A small, fast, well-constructed bullet delivering a violent energy transfer on impact was a genuinely novel concept for American hunters in the 1910s, and Newton had engineered precisely that outcome by applying his large-case, high-velocity philosophy to a caliber nobody had seriously pushed in that direction before. The .250-3000, arriving 3 years later in 1915, applied the same underlying philosophy to a larger, more capable platform. Newton necked down the .30-06 Springfield case, already recognized as one of the most efficient and well-proven cartridge cases in American service, down to accept a quarter-caliber bullet. And the resulting case had considerably more powder capacity relative to its bullet diameter than nearly anything else on the American commercial market at the time. Loaded with the 100-grain bullet Newton preferred, the cartridge would have delivered outstanding terminal performance on deer-sized game at a genuinely useful velocity, likely somewhere in the range of 2,800 to 2,900 feet per second, flat shooting, effective, and well suited to the actual hunting conditions most American deer hunters faced. Loaded instead with the lighter 87-grain bullet Savage insisted on, the same case pushed that lighter projectile to the full 3,000 feet per second the marketing campaign wanted, At the cost of the deeper penetration and heavier bullet construction Newton believed serious hunters actually needed. Both versions worked, in the narrow sense that both killed deer effectively under most field conditions. But the specific weakness Newton had warned about did materialize in the field over the following years. The lightly constructed 87-grain factory bullet, driven at extremely high velocity, would sometimes expand too violently on impact, failing to penetrate deeply enough to reliably reach the vital organs on a larger or more heavily muscled animal. A real and documented terminal ballistics limitation that traces directly back to the exact compromise Newton had argued against during the original design process. That is worth stating plainly, because it validates the engineering judgment Newton held in a way that goes beyond simple hindsight. He was not merely a designer whose preferences were overruled by a company with different priorities. He was a designer whose specific, stated technical objection to a marketing-driven compromise turned out to describe a real limitation that showed up in the field for decades afterward, hunters occasionally losing animals to bullet failure exactly the way Newton had predicted when he lost the internal argument over bullet weight in 1915. The 253,000 remained an excellent cartridge despite this limitation, genuinely capable in the hands of a hunter who understood its characteristics and selected appropriate ammunition accordingly, and it built a lasting reputation as one of the finest small-caliber deer cartridges ever produced. But the specific compromise baked into its most famous factory loading. The very compromise immortalized in its name was not the engineering solution Newton had preferred. It was the solution a marketing department preferred, imposed on a design built by a man who no longer had the leverage to insist on his own better judgment once the cartridge left his hands and entered the savage factory. Here is what all of this actually cost Charles Newton, in the terms that mattered most to the man himself. Savage Arms built substantial and lasting commercial value on both cartridges Newton designed. The 22 high power generated real sales and, more importantly, real brand credibility during a formative period for the company, establishing Savage as a manufacturer capable of genuine cartridge innovation rather than simply chambering rounds designed elsewhere. The 253,000 did even more, becoming one of the defining cartridges associated with the most celebrated rifle platform the company built, the Model 99, and remaining in continuous production and continuous commercial relevance for more than a century after its introduction, a level of lasting success that very few American sporting cartridges of any era have achieved. Newton, meanwhile, spent the years following those two successes trying repeatedly to convert his demonstrated design genius into a lasting business of his own, and failed every single time. The Newton Arms Company collapsed within roughly 16 months of its founding, undone by the same reality that undermines many brilliant inventors who lack matching business and financial infrastructure. Insufficient capital, insufficient manufacturing scale, and insufficient margin for error in an industry where established competitors like Savage already possessed all three. The Chasse. Newton Rifle Corporation followed a similar path into receivership in 1918. Further ventures under further names met similar fates. Each failure represented not simply a business setback, but a direct, painful confirmation of exactly the imbalance this story has been describing from the beginning. Newton could design a cartridge that made a company famous. He could not, despite repeated attempts across more than a decade, build the company that would let him capture that same value for himself. And every attempt to do so instead consumed capital, reputation, and years of his working life that could have gone toward further design work, the one thing at which he had already proven himself among the finest in the world. He died in New Haven, Connecticut, in 1932, at 64 years old, having designed cartridges that by that point had already generated enormous cumulative value for other companies across more than 2 decades, without himself having achieved the kind of lasting personal wealth that value should reasonably have produced for the man who actually created it. There is a broader pattern worth naming here, one this channel has documented across other stories, and that the career of Newton represents in an unusually complete and well-documented form. American firearms history is full of companies whose fortunes were built substantially on the work of independent designers. Men who supplied the actual engineering genius while the company supplied the capital, the manufacturing scale, and, critically, the ownership structure that determined who actually captured the resulting value. Newton is a particularly stark example because his failure was not simply that Savage failed to compensate him adequately for 2 individual designs. It is that even when he tried, repeatedly and with real determination, to close that gap by building his own competing enterprise, the same structural forces that had denied him ownership of his own earlier work made it nearly impossible for him to succeed as an owner in his own right. 2 cartridges. The Savage name on both. A century of continuous production and real commercial value that Newton himself designed into existence and never meaningfully shared in, followed by more than a decade of his own increasingly desperate attempts to finally own something of comparable value. Each attempt ending in exactly the kind of financial collapse the man who designed the 253,000 should never have had to experience even once, let alone repeatedly, across the final 2 decades of his working life. So what is the actual verdict on Charles Newton? He was, by any honest measure available to us more than a century later, one of the genuinely great American cartridge designers, a man who built 2 commercially transformative rounds using little more than his own obsessive study of case capacity, powder charge, and terminal ballistics, competing successfully against fully staffed professional engineering departments while practicing law to pay his bills. Savage Arms built a real and lasting part of its reputation on his work. The 253,000 alone represents more than a century of continuous commercial relevance, a level of sustained success that very few cartridges from any era designed by anyone working for any company have ever achieved. That is the actual legacy Charles Newton left, whether or not his name appears prominently in the corporate history Savage itself tells of the round. What he did not achieve, despite every reasonable expectation that a man of his ability should have, was lasting personal wealth, business stability, or ownership of anything comparable in value to what he had handed to Savage twice over. His own ventures, built around his own name and his own continued design genius, failed repeatedly. Not for lack of engineering talent, which by every available account remained exceptional throughout his career, but for lack of the capital, the scale, and perhaps the specific business acumen that turning genuine invention into a lasting company has always demanded, separately and distinctly from the invention itself. There is a real and important distinction worth making plainly here. One this channel tries to be honest about, even when it complicates a simple story of corporate villainy. Savage Arms did not steal the designs Charles Newton created. He was paid for his work by whatever arrangement existed between an independent contract designer and the company that manufactured his cartridges commercially, and the specific financial terms of those individual arrangements are not fully documented in the historical record available today. What is documented, clearly and repeatedly, is the outcome. A company built lasting, generational commercial value on cartridges Charles Newton designed, while the designer himself spent the final 2 decades of his working life failing over and over to capture any comparable share of that value for himself. That gap between the value a genuinely brilliant inventor creates and the value he actually manages to keep is the real subject of this story. and it did not require a single dramatic villain to produce it. It required only the ordinary, unremarkable structure of an entire industry, repeated across a career, until a man who gave America two of its finest sporting cartridges died without the wealth either one of them should reasonably have bought him. The 253,000 is still on the shelf in nearly every hardware store that sells centerfire rifle ammunition in America today. Charles Newton is still, outside of a fairly small circle of cartridge historians and collectors, largely forgotten. Both of those facts are true at the same time, and this channel exists precisely to make sure the second one stops being quite so true. There is a specific kind of quiet justice available in simply saying his name out loud, on a channel watched by the exact hunters who load the round he designed every autumn without knowing whose engineering judgment put it in their hands. He does not need a monument. He does not need a rifle bearing his own name in a modern catalogue, though for a brief period he tried, more than once, to build exactly that, and failed every time. What he actually needed, and what history can still provide even a century late, is simply an accurate accounting of who did the work and what it actually cost him to have done it as well as he did.